to the Move 101 podcast. In today's episode, we're reviewing the scientific evidence as well as our own experiences taking magnesium as a sleep aid. As parents, many of us are short on sleep, whether that's from kids waking us up, keeping us up, or simply just wanting some time to ourselves for once. That said, we know sleep is one of the most potent ways we can improve or maintain our health, so Dr. Garrett and I are always on the lookout for tools we can use to improve that aspect of our own health. One of those tools is magnesium, which has been shown to have a relationship both with sleep quality and duration. So in this episode, we get into the mechanisms for how magnesium can influence sleep, the research support for its use as a sleep aid, recommended protocols for intake, as well as our own results and recommendations for better sleep. We hope you find this information useful, and as always, thanks for listening.
Alrighty, folks, welcome to another episode of the Move 101 podcast. Dr. Levi Garrett here, joined as always by my colleague and good friend, Dr. Andrew Harvison. How's it going, bud?
Good friend? Like, oh man, it's a stretch.
I meant great friend, I guess.
Best friend.
Yeah. Let me tell you about my best friend. Anyways, all right, so we got the cheesy intro out of the way. Which lets us get into the meat of today's discussion. And before we get into what we're talking about, I want to remind you guys that the information that we're sharing today is not medical advice. As always, you need to be speaking with your doctor prior to trying or taking any supplementation. What we're doing today is providing educational material to you solely. So keep that in mind. But that secret thing that we're talking about today is, in fact, magnesium. There's been a lot of discussion around this supplement as being a helpful sleep aid, or at least part of sleep aid cocktails. And so we wanted to drill down on this specific nutrient for this week. And before we talk about its mechanisms and all the other fascinating things that magnesium can do, we should probably explain to you what magnesium is. And simply put, it's a nutrient that's commonly found in things like nuts. One of the best sources there is going to be cashews, in leafy greens like spinach. And I think if memory serves, and obviously the amounts are going to vary, but these are kind of the best bang for your buck foods, if you will. Whereas a smaller amount of cashews is going to yield a greater amount of magnesium than something like walnuts or otherwise. Similarly with the leafy greens, spinach being kind of one of those primary foods that you'll find it in. But we also see it in beans. We see it in seeds. One of the higher seeds that we see it in is pumpkin seeds. So it's the fall time. It's perfect time to go pumpkin carving, save all those pumpkin seeds and eat them by the handfuls. Again, not medical advice. But pumpkin seeds are very beneficial or have been found to have high levels of magnesium. And then my personal favorite, dark chocolate. So instead of taking a magnesium supplement before you go to sleep, eat like a pound of dark chocolate and you're good to go. Once again, I must remind you that this is not medical advice. Magnesium, again, is a common nutrient, but more importantly, it's essential for more than 300 processes in our body. Magnesium helps maintain a healthy immune system, regulates muscle and nerve function, and we see this in protein synthesis, muscular contractions, as well as nerve function. It also aids in regulating blood glucose, blood pressure, cardiac excitability, and not to mention, magnesium also helps keep our bones strong. And in fact, more than 50% of the magnesium in our body is stored in bones. Further, it also helps with hormone receptor binding. Now, I say all these things, but what does this mean in terms of sleep? It's like, it's doing all this stuff, but who cares if we're talking specifically about sleep? So I'm going to walk you through a figure from a paper, a study that we pulled, and this is speaking specifically to older adults, 55 years and older. And there's a couple reasons for this. Andrew, you could jump in if I need to add anything here. But basically, the reason why it's looking at older adults is there's going to be a typically seen physiologically a decrease in bone mass. Okay. And what did we say? Magnesium is primarily stored in the bone. So if we have a decrease in bone mass, then we will likely see decreases in magnesium. Low dietary intake. So, this individual or someone older or later in life may be making these particular dietary intake decisions or not taking in as much magnesium through their nutrition, as well as altered magnesium metabolism. So keep this in mind as why we're kind of focusing on this 55 and older population, but this may also apply for folks that are younger that have issues with bone mass or bone density, as well as their dietary intake. Now, those three things that I mentioned will lead to a potential for magnesium deficiency. And there's been a correlation or a connection with a decrease in magnesium or a deficiency in magnesium with increases in disrupted sleep, as well as neuroendocrine dysregulation or deregulation. So as we kind of move through this figure that you guys will see, those watching the video version of this, we have this older adult that has a deficiency in magnesium, which is leading again to disrupted sleep, as well as neuroendocrine dysregulation. And because of this, it's going to alter our sleep, right? And more specifically, are the mechanisms for that is magnesium is an NMDA antagonist and a GABA agonist. Now, what does GABA do for us? We talked a little bit about it being or aiding in, this is magnesium, aiding in hormone receptor binding. This GABA is a neurotransmitter that helps quiet or silence or relax our central nervous system. And what this is trying to say here is that if our central nervous system is excited, it's going to be a lot more difficult or challenging for us to sleep. We'll have disturbed sleep and disturbed and disrupted sleep due to central nervous system excitability. So this is then going to lead to increased nighttime wakefulness. So we're going to be up more frequently, and we're going to be, which ultimately means that we're sleeping less. So we're going to have challenges in initiating our sleep, maintaining sleep, and then without this rest and recovery, we're going to have big challenges functioning throughout the day. So those are kind of some of the mechanisms or how magnesium plays a role in our sleep.
As you just heard, Levi is kind of drawing the connection for you guys in terms of why or how magnesium even plays a role in sleep. And then I'm going to jump into some of the research results. So now that we've kind of understood the role that magnesium could play, the next question is, well, does it actually work? Does this show us any evidence in research for actually helping sleep? And the answer is it depends. As with many things in science, there are so many variables at play. But I'm going to get into some of those results, and then we're going to go from there and talk about some of the different protocols that we see, as well as our own results. So we did actually try and take some magnesium and see how this worked for us. But if we look at the actual research results, what does research tell us? So it tells us, as Levi kind of mentioned, there's a relationship where there are some associations between magnesium deficiency and sleep, but it can also be beneficial in just an insomniac population, people who are having trouble sleeping. What we don't see in research is people who are already sleeping well, magnesium is really not going to do much for you, right? So yes, there's an association there. If we look at research methods, we're just to very quickly mention that associations or correlations or relationships, whatever word you want to use there, it means that one factor is related to the other, but we don't have a causal factor, right? We're not saying magnesium causes you to sleep better. The relationship is that if magnesium is deficient, you're likely also sleep deprived. So from there, we need to then explore from randomized controlled trials, where we can determine causation. Does this play a role? And again, in older adults or those who have sleep deprivation or insomnia, the support is mixed, but there are some studies that show benefit. Some other interesting things that we'll see in the research literature is that there are other factors beyond just sleep deprivation that will include or that will induce a magnesium deficiency. So chronic stress is a big one. Levi mentioned this idea of GABA and how that quiets the central nervous system. It quiets this overthinking or the very active brain. So if you're under a lot of stress, you're actually going to experience more of that. Other things include alcohol dependency. So people who are alcoholic are typically magnesium deficient. People who have Crohn's disease or celiac disease often have issues with absorption of magnesium. Also, type 2 diabetics typically have low magnesium, again, due to typically issues with excreting too much magnesium in the urine. So there are different groups beyond just the older adult or just the insomniac that could benefit from magnesium supplementation. But those are the main things that we see in research, is that if you fall into one of those groups, magnesium supplementation may actually benefit your sleep. Some interesting things here. I found that one of the common sleep aids that you hear about is melatonin. There's certainly a relationship, again, between magnesium levels and melatonin production in the body. But also, if we look at exogenous melatonin supplementation or exogenous magnesium supplementation, the results are interesting in that while melatonin is often thought of as a very common sleep aid, the actual research on melatonin is not terribly supportive. And one of the meta-analyses, a meta-analysis is a study of studies, right? It's basically a pooling of a lot of different research work that's been done and looking statistically at the overall findings to determine what is the overall effect. So if we look at meta-analyses of melatonin, sorry, that's a tongue twister. The overall improvement in sleep time is about 4 minutes, which is certainly not that impressive, versus what we see with magnesium is actually 16 minutes. Now, statistically, we cannot actually compare those and say magnesium is better than melatonin because those are different studies. However, I would note that is an interesting discrepancy, neither of which are terribly practically meaningful. Perhaps 4 minutes and 16 minutes aren't a huge difference in terms of overall sleep time. But I did find that to be an interesting difference in some of the research that is out there on melatonin and magnesium. Take that as you will, right? So again, the overall body of research indicates, yes, there's a relationship here that we can say exists between magnesium deficiency and lack of sleep or sleep quality issues, as well as some of these other minor, there's a little bit of research support, but it's mixed. So I wouldn't say there's a ton of research support for this being a causal factor for improving sleep, though in some populations it may help. Really quickly, I did also want to mention some safety issues. Magnesium does appear to be pretty well tolerated. Higher doses, the main side effect that's going to be reported in higher doses is soft stool or diarrhea. Always a fun one. The interesting thing here is that side effect is unlikely to happen when magnesium is obtained via food. So this is only in supplemental form is when we typically will see that lovely side effect. Mm-hmm. Something else interesting to note, the tolerable upper limit for magnesium intake is 350 milligrams per day. However, the recommended dietary allowance or RDA for magnesium for men is 400 to 420 milligrams, mm-hmm. and for women, 310 to 320 milligrams. And so the question then is, well, if our RDA is 400 to 420 for men, that's above the tolerable upper limit, isn't it? And again, we go back to this idea of if you're obtaining that through food, that tolerable upper limit is it's not out the window, but it's changed a little bit. We're less likely to experience any side effects as a result of magnesium in the foods that Levi mentioned. Toxicity is very rare from food sources. What happens in the body, your body is obviously a pretty incredible thing. The kidneys will remove excess magnesium in the urine. So the problem there is if you have kidney disease, that may be something to consider, an issue you would certainly want to look at with your doctor. So be careful with any sort of high dose or long-term magnesium supplementation that goes over and above that tolerable upper limit of 350 milligrams per day. That said, kind of wrapping a bow on the risk profile, magnesium seems to be pretty low risk. Certainly doesn't make sleep worse. It may be beneficial in improving sleep. Again, if you fall into one of those categories of either insomnia, maybe an older population, maybe type 2 diabetic, maybe alcoholic, and maybe someone with Crohn's or celiac disease. Any issues where you have a magnesium deficiency. And
real quickly, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but in those papers, was it looking at sleep duration when you referred to the increase, the 14-minute increase versus the 6-minute or relative
16 minutes for magnesium versus 4 minutes for melatonin. And that was total sleep time. So if we're looking at when you fell asleep, when you woke up, there's also some statistics for sleep efficiency, meaning like if you spent 10 hours in bed, but you only got 7 hours of sleep, 70% sleep efficiency. There are some statistics there. Melatonin, I want to say it was 2.2% sleep efficiency improved. I did not see a similar statistic for magnesium.
Yeah. And maybe that's something we'll talk about when we conclude here, is as far as sleep duration versus the ability to get to sleep might be something that we can get into too. So for us, when we tested this out, we used a Thorne magnesium biglycinate product. It was a powder. One of the primary reasons for us using this is it's NSF certified for sport, which means that this testing company ensures that it's free from substances banned by major sport organizations. And so we felt that it would be one of the safer products, or at least somewhat regulated in a relatively unregulated industry. So we decided to go with that product. As Andrew mentioned, the suggested protocol seemed to range between 300 and 400 milligrams, whether it was teen, female, male, etc. And it was recommended to use between 30 and 60 minutes before bed. For me personally, I consumed 400 milligrams or 4 grams approximately an hour before bed. But I would, so for example, to maybe go a little bit more specific, I would mix my 2 scoops in water and drink that. And within 30 to 45 minutes, I knew that I was going to be heading to my bedroom. Once I got to the bedroom, it could be laying down and doing some light reading, or maybe, putting some clothes away, or some kind of nighttime chores, or whatever's part of my nighttime routine. But I found myself aiming to sleep around 45 minutes after consuming my 4 milligrams.
Yep. Very similar. I followed the same sort of protocol, about 45 minutes to an hour before bed, 400 milligrams or 4 grams. And as far as timing, so looking back again at some of the research I saw, there were groups taking magnesium twice a day. So some in the morning, some in the evening. I did not see a whole lot of benefit or support, I should say, for a timing effect. There seems to be a recommendation kind of closer to the evening time or towards bedtime, but I did not see any firm science that would support this being a timing dependent intake. More so just making sure that the total daily intake meets the RDA, or that you're not magnesium deficient again.
Yep. And one last thing, part of this protocol that we did to try to test its efficacy on us. Of course, there's not a ton of subjects for our one-off study here, but we did take the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the PSQI. This is a commonly used instrument in these sleep studies. So we can go over some of those when we get into kind of our results and experience with this thing.
Yeah, so let's jump into the results that we experienced. I think I'll throw out, Levi, you actually found this. Do you want to give the website that you used if people are interested in trying to kind of track the PSQI results themselves, if they want to experiment with some of this?
Yep. So I found it at, it was a Snooze University calculator. So if you Google search Snooze University calculator, you should be able to find it. And it actually has the PSQI as part of it, much like a BMI calculator or whatever other tool online. But it asks the same questions that you would typically fill out on hard copy, and it gives you a global score at the bottom. And so it has a couple different categories, and as you read through it, you'll see that. And then it scores or kind of tallies based on each of those sections. And the score is out of 21, and a 5 or lower means that you are in you have a healthy sleep habit, or you have a healthy relationship with sleep, I guess you can say it that way.
They classify it as good sleep, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And then anything above 5, you're technically classified as potentially insomniac.
And it's recommended that you contact your doctor. But these questions range from how many hours in bed versus how much you actually sleep. It talks about your wakefulness. Are you a snorer? Do you get up due to muscle spasms? And it also has a section where if you have a roommate, and they can fill that out for you, and your spouse can indicate, the frequency of some of these things taking place. But it ranges from never happening in a month, less than, or once or less a week, or less than once a month, I guess, which would be less than once a week in general. And then once or twice a week, 3 or more times per week.
Yeah, nice. I mean, it's a quick, easy questionnaire that you can do to give you a quantifiable look at how your sleep is. And it's used in many studies. That was the reason we picked it out, is because this is commonly used in sleep study. So we calculated sleep time as well as PSQI index. So Levi, what was your before? What were you averaging for sleep time and your PSQI?
Yep. So we were looking. So there's a couple things, and I'll try to save most of this for the end and just read through the specific results. So in fact, that's what I will do. So I found myself going to bed. It asked when you typically go to bed. I found myself initially going to bed by 10:15, and by going to bed, that would be a safe assumption of when I was actually sleeping, which means that I was getting into my bedroom around 9:45, 10 o'clock, and sleeping by 10:15. It asks you how long it takes to go to bed, and I put between 5 and 10 minutes. So this would be when I set my book down, when I set my phone down. Just kidding. I never look at my phone before I go to sleep. Or basically when I'm aiming to sleep, how long does it take? And it's usually between 5 and 10 minutes. I mean, 10 minutes would be an extreme end. I usually 5 minutes is usually a max. When I'm going to bed, I'm going to bed. And then I was getting up at around 5:45 in the morning, which means that my actual hours per sleep or hours of sleep per evening is about 7.5. This is where I kind of would most accurately find myself. What about you for that first section?
Yeah, so I don't have I don't have data on section by section. I'll just give my total sleep time before and after in my PSQI. So for me, before taking magnesium, my total sleep time, so averaged out over basically 2 weeks, was 7.4 hours of sleep time. So my bedtime is usually 10:45 is when I'm trying to be asleep, and then I wake up at 6:15. So that is, I'm missing a little bit of that, but I'm pretty close to 7.5 hours or so. When and my PSQI global score. So again, we're looking at a score of anything 5 and under is good sleep. I was a 2. Again, you and I are really not the target audience for this, and so our results will probably not be terribly overwhelming here. But I think, again, for the populations that this is designed for or targeted towards, certainly something that may be interesting. So sleep time did not really change at all with magnesium. So 7.27 hours, slightly different, but I would classify that as just slight changes in actually when I got to bed. We had a couple travel days. I had a birthday, turned 40. And so was up a little bit later than normal on a few nights under this magnesium protocol. But PSQI global score was a 2 in the post study as well. So really nothing changed quantifiably for me. The one thing I did notice differently was I felt like, and this is very subjective, but I did feel or notice I didn't dream as much when taking magnesium. Just noticed kind of I slept well. I feel like I was rested and restored when I woke up, but noticed a lack of dreams. I don't think I dreamt once that I can remember. Of course, we don't always remember those, but I don't feel that I remembered any dreams during the several weeks that I was taking magnesium, which I thought was interesting. I made note of that in this sleep log that we were keeping track of. And one of the things that I found interesting there, I was actually listening to Dr. Matthew Walker, who's a sleep expert and a researcher in the area of sleep. Great book on why we sleep. I always recommend people to check that out. But he actually mentioned this in a discussion of sleep and alcohol, that when we are in REM debt, so for people who are drinking, our brain, we don't sleep as well. When you have alcohol in your system, you get less REM sleep. And what happens is your body sometimes, well, he said one of the frequent things that he sees is on nights that people drink, they actually will have more vivid dreams in those mornings. And it doesn't indicate quality sleep. In fact, what it is or his mechanistic explanation of that was the brain actually keeps track of REM sleep. So we have kind of this internal clock that your body or your brain is keeping track of. And then when you are in REM debt, your brain will actually give you stronger dreams as almost a encouragement, let's say, or a push towards getting more sleep. And this is completely hypothetical here on my part, but I thought perhaps I'm not dreaming as much because I'm getting more REM. I don't know. This would be something that would be interesting to actually study. We didn't have access to, the tools to measure REM or NREM sleep here, but it brings up an interesting point here. There are sleep kind of biometric tracking devices out there, of course. Unfortunately, most of them are not super accurate. I would, however, be interested in it would have been interesting to kind of tie in some of that data. I don't have access to any of those. So that was just one of the things that I found interesting in this. So I'll throw it back to you, Levi, in terms of some of those other categories that you were going through and then your kind of overall results.
Yeah, I mean, so mine changed. Initially, it was a 5, and then it moved to a 4 after starting the magnesium supplementation. That said, I don't know how much of it was due to magnesium. I personally didn't find myself falling asleep quicker or sleeping any deeper per se. In looking and comparing the two assessments, the wakefulness throughout the evening and either due to spasms, which was not common, or waking up to go to the bathroom did not change. What changed the most for me between the two was the time I went to bed, and the duration of sleep didn't vary too much, but the time in which I went to bed, and then the amount of times I woke up due to heat. That's one of the questions. How often do you wake up from being too hot versus how often do you wake up from being too cold? There was a shift in seasons, and I live in a place that has 4 full seasons. My house also is not traditionally heated and cooled with modern, I guess, normal modern central heating and air. We have a swamp cooler that cools our house down, that does a great job in one section of the house, but doesn't travel to the other bedrooms so well, which means that our bedrooms tend to be a little bit warmer in the summertime. So, I was up probably 3 times a week due to heat. I'd wake up. And the good thing here, though, is I didn't have a problem going back to sleep. I didn't wake up and then wrestle around for an hour. As soon as I woke up, I'd be kind of warm, kick the sheets off, or kind of move around for a second, or I'd have to go to the bathroom and I was hot at the same time, come back, fall asleep right away. I didn't have a problem going back to sleep. The only time I have problems going back to sleep is when it's after probably 4 o'clock. If it's any time before 4, I can get back to sleep. If it's 4 a.m., I'm teetering right on that. Well, I've gotten enough sleep to get through the next day. Sometimes it gets my mind going and I struggle to go back to bed. And at that point, I don't go back to sleep. I get up and I start the day earlier than I normally would. And then I would go to bed usually earlier the next night. So due to the changing of season, I did not sleep. I think the 3 days a week from waking up due to heat changed my score the most. That was the biggest disparity. Whereas now I don't wake up from it being too hot or too cold in the same manner. Now I was only 1 point off, so it'd lead me to believe with those calculations that it was probably due to waking up from the heat. So as far as the magnesium goes for me, I did not notice any, I didn't see a noticeable difference that would be linked to the magnesium. What I actually found for me was, and maybe we're kind of transitioning to the conclusion section, unless you want to hang out here a little bit longer, but for me, the biggest things that I found, and it was, this experience was great just because it made me more intentional about my sleep and when I'm getting to bed, how I'm sleeping once I've gone to bed and all those things. But I need to be tired. No duh, Levi. But I don't mean just tired from the day or that it's been a long day. I need to be physically exhausted. The days that I was that, and again, no duh. But the reason why I say that is the overwhelming majority of people live a sedentary life, which is not going to physically exhaust you. So the days that I was cutting wood, that I was doing manual labor, that I'm rolling hard at jujitsu or training hard at the gym, I found those to be the easiest to go to bed and sleeping the best for me personally. So again, not a shocker here, but it was a great reminder of getting yourself ready for bed, not just the sleep hygiene right before you go to sleep, but all the other things that you can do throughout the day, whether that's your nutrition to make sure that you have enough magnesium via your food, or whether that's physically exhausting yourself. And for me, that seemed to be the best indicator of how easy it was for me to go to bed and how well I slept throughout the night.
What are some of your, do you have other like sleep hygiene? Again, not necessarily before you go to bed, but what are some of the other keys for you in quality sleep? Because again, we're not the target audience because you and I both sleep well. So yeah. I'm kind of curious, are there things that you're doing that you think play a role in actually helping you sleep? If that's the intended outcome, is to help people find ways to sleep better, which is what we're doing. What are the things that you've identified as the things that help you sleep well?
Yeah, I think trying to manually rest your mind and your body. And there's a couple ways that we do that. The primary one is working them. So doing something. I think for me to tie it back to this family piece is going on an evening walk which will create some physical exertion. And on that evening walk, go with your family to continue building relationships and connection with your spouse or your kids, or maybe you don't have those, but you have an animal or something, to kind of invest in that emotional and social piece. But that will also, in general, quote, fatigue the mind too. Having a deep discussion on a walk while exerting yourself physically. Those are two ways that I have found over the last couple of months since reading Stan Efferding's book, The Vertical Diet, and recommending the walks after you eat. I found the evening walk or the evening physical activity is a great way, especially when I haven't exhausted myself earlier in the day with training. My training is usually earlier in the morning. So, it doesn't have the pre-nighttime effect of fatigue literally in that physical way, but the nighttime walks and nighttime conversations are helpful. Sometimes
do you guys, sorry to interrupt. Do you guys do that every night after dinner?
No, not every night. No, but we're aware of it and try to do the best job we can. I think something that you and I talked about was routine and consistency, something that in general I'm terrible with. There's certain staples for sure, but there is a lot of, there is a lack of routine, although there's still some consistency. I would say that we're better with consistency than we are with routine. And what I mean by that is, like, we travel a lot. We go and visit family. Family comes and visits us. I travel for work sometimes. And so I'm sleeping in a hotel or at a friend or family's house, and then I'm not in my bed. I don't have my spouse next to me. I'm sleeping on a couch or whatever that might be. And so I think that affects my sleep, but I've also developed the ability to adapt to those environments so that when I am away, it's not as good, but it's not terrible either. I'm able to function normally and effectively despite the rattling of my routine.
I think it's interesting that we're going to have our answers to this question are very much indicative of if anyone's listened to this podcast before. Andrew's a systems guy. Levi's more kind of, I don't want a system. So it's interesting that you're noting the need for adaptability, and I'm going to give an answer that's very rigid and here's exactly what I do every day.
Yep.
So here are, so speaking of systems, here's the system I use that hopefully, again, the reason we're doing this is to hopefully help some people if you're struggling with sleep. Here are some things that I've implemented, and I've implemented these not just randomly. Like, these are things that other scientists, other sleep experts have talked about. Some of these you may have heard before, but this is kind of the system that I try to follow daily. Again, that routine aspect I think is very important. And for me, the first key here, or first step, is going to bed and waking up at the same time every day, including weekends. And that last piece there is one that I neglected for a long time, where I would sleep in on the weekends, and then Monday morning comes around and, oh boy, it's a rude awakening, literally. Right. And so kind of in conjunction with that is making sure that making sure that I have the opportunity for 8 hours of sleep. So getting in bed, this is something I actually adopted from you, Levi, is even if you're not going to sleep, just be in bed at X amount of time so that you have the opportunity for 8 hours of sleep. For me, I usually try to be in bed at 10:15 because I know I'm waking up at 6:15, and I wake up at 6:15 every day now. Again, this was something that I realized later in life was the importance of going to bed and waking up at the same time, and not having differences for those weekend days. So allowing yourself 8 hours is an important one for me, and having that same wake up, same sleep time. Next piece is stopping caffeine intake 10 to 12 hours before bedtime. The piece here that scientifically is supported is the half-life of caffeine. So caffeine has a 5 to 6 hour half-life and I want to say 10-hour quarter life. So the way I've heard Dr. Matthew Walker talk about this, which I thought was interesting, because there are people who will say, oh, I can drink a cup of coffee in the evening after dinner and I sleep just fine. And the problem is we are very poor at judging sleep quality, right? So yes, you may go to bed and fall asleep on time, but your actual sleep quality, if caffeine is in your system, does go down guaranteed. Different people are going to have different tolerances to that. So it may be worse for some than others. But the way he explains this is, would you have a quarter cup of coffee right before going to bed and think that you're going to sleep fine? Because if you have caffeine after, within that window closer to bedtime, that is effectively what you're doing. So cutting off caffeine intake 10 to 12 hours before bedtime to make sure that caffeine is out of my system at that time when I'm going to bed. Another big piece that I have found to be very helpful, we know that sleep cycles are regulated heavily by the circadian system, which responds to light. So the first thing I try to do upon waking, I go to the bathroom, but have a drink of water and go outside. A little harder in the wintertime when it's not always light out at 6 in the morning or so, 6:15. But getting sunlight in your eyes, if you don't have access to the sun, if you live in a northern hemisphere or it's wintertime, getting access to bright white light is one of those things that can help get that circadian rhythm started. And basically what this does is it regulates the hormonal response. So we talked about melatonin earlier. Melatonin, the release of melatonin starts to elevate in those evening hours. And that's dictated by when you see light in the morning time. So cortisol and melatonin are both responding to light and darkness based on when you expose yourself to light in the morning and when you start seeing darkness in the evening. And so regulating light, most of you have heard, avoid blue light in the evenings. Now that we have so much technology around and in our lives, very much a part of the same thing of trying to be in darker environments in the evening where it's soft or yellow light, not bright white, not blue. And in the morning time, the complete opposite of that. So you're trying to use light to your advantage, or I am trying to use light to my advantage, exposing myself to that. So I go for a walk in the mornings to get that sunlight, also to kind of wake the system up. And I find it's a great time for kind of just mentally to give myself some time to think, to pray, to be grateful, as well as get those light factors that influence sleep and actually have a very strong influence on sleep. A couple other things. Avoiding drinking too much fluid close to bedtime. Levi, you mentioned that oftentimes if you wake up in the morning, it's to have to use the restroom. I find that the two most common reasons that if I wake up before my alarm goes off, it is either to have to go to the bathroom, or sometimes I will wake up before my alarm. And like you said, the brain starts the wheels start clicking. And so for me, I found that making sure I don't have to wake up to go to the bathroom is a key. So not drinking fluids within an hour. That was one of the reasons I actually originally started this magnesium protocol 30 to 40 minutes before bed. And I found that a couple times I had to wake up because I was drinking more fluid than usual before bed. So I backed that up to, an hour or so. And that seemed to help, making sure we're eliminating some of those factors that could cause us to wake up or earlier than we want to. So avoiding drinking too much fluid too close to bed. And like I said, like you said, the other common factor is the brain starting to turn. And I haven't actually done this yet, but this is as a result of doing this. I found that keeping a sleep log was helpful, but also one of the things I want to experiment with, and I don't know if you've done this, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, is you hear people talk about a sleep journal, or just a kind of, not necessarily a sleep journal, but more so a kind of a nightly, like, here's what I want to do tomorrow. And here are maybe some of the things that I was either proud of or some of the successes that I had today, as a way to kind of, as a brain dump, right? Getting some of that stuff out of your brain so that you don't have anything kind of pulling you back to yesterday, right? You kind of write down the things that were either good or bad from the day. So those are on paper and they're out of the brain. You don't have to spend mental energy focusing on those. And then writing a few things that you want to get done the next day. So again, you don't have to have any CPU, running in the background of, oh, what do I need to do today? You've already got it written down. So you can dispose of that mental energy. So that's something I actually have identified as a result of doing this as something I want to try doing a little bit more, is keeping track of that so that I don't have those early morning thoughts of, oh, what am I doing today? It's out of the brain. So have you experimented with any of that?
Yeah. In fact, a lot of my to-do list for the next day is written the night before. I mean, that's just it for a couple of reasons. Number one, like you said, kind of the brain dump to get out of my head, but also to have a plan for the next day already. So I'm not waking up going, what do I got to do today? Oh man. And then I'm spending the first 20 or 30 minutes figuring out what I want to do that day. I've done it the night before going, I've done this, I still need to do that. And so it's kind of ready to go in that way. And I find that to be most successful when I practice that habit. So
what are your overall thoughts here? Is magnesium something that you would continue taking for sleep?
I probably will not continue taking it, not because I didn't like it or because it's bad. I didn't find a noticeable enough difference, but that's not limited to this thing. It's pretty much any supplement I've taken.
Yeah, I think I have a similar answer, although I feel like I'm still intrigued a little bit by it. Like I do feel like my sleep definitely hasn't gotten worse, right? I feel
For
like
sure.
if anything, although the numbers, like our quantifiable data does not necessarily support me taking it, my subjective experience is definitely not. It's maybe a slight bit above neutral, right? In the positive, where it feels like, maybe I do want to experiment with a slightly smaller dose. I want to try the 300 milligram per day. I this is probably too much information, but the old side effect of I didn't quite get into the diarrhea phase, but soft stool was noticeable, and so I'm already probably not magnesium deficient anyway. And we mentioned this idea of chicken versus egg, and that you and I are really not the target audience here, in that we are eating pretty well, whole foods, and likely getting a good amount of magnesium through our diets. We're already sleeping well, we're exercising. And so neither of us are insomniac. So we aren't the target audience here. And so I don't think 400 milligrams per day for me was necessary. Although again, that was, largely the recommended protocol across research study. So I'm going to experiment a little bit more with a slightly lower dose. And I think I'm going to experiment a little bit more kind of on and off and see if I continue to notice anything different. It's not something that I can foresee myself taking consistently for years. Again, just because the difference is pretty minimal, I would say. But I feel like I haven't quite gotten a definitive answer for me yet. I want to, again, kind of cycle off of it and see if anything changes, cycle back on maybe a couple times and see if I notice anything. But the main recommendation I would say is, if you are in one of those populations where you are either insomniac or some of the other categories that we mentioned, whether you're
bone density lost.
If you're an older adult or someone who's just experiencing trouble sleeping, it's not so much that I would say take magnesium as a supplement, as I would say, again, we always talk about this, is pull the biggest levers that you can. So are you going to bed and waking up at the same time? Are you stopping your caffeine intake? Are you drinking alcohol? If so, like, those are three big things. And I would add the light exposure in the mornings and darkness exposure in the evenings. Those are four big levers that I would say pull those first. And if you're pulling those and still having trouble sleeping, maybe look at something like this.
And if I may add, the big levers are free. The going to bed earlier, the not looking at your phone, the waking up and getting moving, like, those are free. And
they're not sexy, but they're free and they work, right? That's the tough part, is we know for a fact those things absolutely make a big difference in sleep. And yet they're the most challenging to actually pull those levers consistently. And so that's, again, that's where to start. If you're doing those things and still struggling, look at some other stuff. But
the argument is that if you're doing those things, this probably isn't.
You're likely not magnesium deficient, right?
And one other thing too, is far as the efficacy of magnesium, there are sleep cocktails out there. So it being paired with other supplementation may increase its efficacy as well. So that might be something else to note, is that so Dr. Andrew Huberman recommends trying one supplement at a time rather than trying a whole cocktail. So this maybe something we continue to stack and try in that manner, or maybe you or the listener would be interested in doing it with that approach. But maybe there is something to it in conjunction with other things that can help individuals with their sleep performance a little bit more. So.
And that's about it. So folks, make sure we're pulling the big levers, as we say with most of the supplement discussions we've had in the past. It's a supplement. This is the 1-2% change that you might see if you're doing everything else correctly. And that's always where to start. So look to pull those big levers. But this may be something that you may be interested in or curious to try, as we were. So your mileage may vary, but hopefully the information here was helpful and educational and something to take with you as you go forward.
Thanks all.
As always, we want to encourage you to take action on one item you heard in today's episode. Also, if you know someone that you think might benefit from this information, please share the episode with them. It's our goal to help more people live healthier lives, and we appreciate your help in sharing the message. Thanks, everybody.